first in the experiential learning series for Center College in 2020. Thank you for joining me today. Few first things. The most important thing I can give you today is the importance of communication. In this uncertain time, as we all struggle to make adjustments to the COVID crisis, communication is key. And on this first thing, I can't stress enough the importance of communication with the community partners that you're hoping to work with, whether that's an individual for a one class meeting or an organization for an entire block of work together. Communication early and often is extremely important. Second thing, communication. Communication is the most important piece that you can bring to your relationship with the students, especially in supporting a community engaged element in your classroom. Communicating expectations, changes in the schedule, all of the nuts and bolts that will need to be addressed in order to make something like this happen will need to be communicated early and often with the students. This is harder remotely or in a hybrid format than it often can be face-to-face. And finally, communication. Communication. I would say that this channel, the third channel of communication I'm mentioning here, is with the administration, making sure that you're on the same page with college policy regarding community engagement, and making sure that you're using the formulas or the forms, I guess, that are provided in terms of liability waivers and things like that. So keeping all three channels of communication as open as possible is really about the most important thing that can support your success in community-based learning or experiential learning generally in the coming semester. Next, I would say is flexibility. We all should expect changes. Things will look different 1 month from now than they do today. They will look different in 3 months. They will look different in 3 days, likely as well. And this is going to continue. I think change is our new constant as we're moving through this. And I think that the way we address it is creatively, trying to think of ways to overcome the challenges that we're sure to encounter and creative new modes of collaboration and new modes of accomplishing the goals that we set out to accomplish with our community partners. So communication, flexibility, and creativity, if you bring these three to the table, you can have a successful community engaged learning experience despite the difficulties that we're going to encounter. So if you're thinking about continuing with the community engaged learning practice, we do in some ways need to come back to the drawing board or the ceramics wheel, if you will, and start a little bit from scratch and make sure that we are anchoring these projects and these experiences in what's important. So anchor it in your specific learning outcomes that you've laid out in your syllabus. Make sure that any experience that you're designing for your students is keyed to one of these specific learning outcomes that can help focus the experience for the student and for yourself as you're putting it together. I would also encourage you to anchor your ideas for collaborations in the current circumstances, using the COVID crisis as a teachable moment, as something that is changing the way in which we all interact with our communities and with the world more broadly. This is one in which I'd say kind of use what's happening to influence the directions your class takes. Speaking to that as well, I think are the revised community needs. What our community partners need now is different than what they needed in February, most likely. So making sure that we're meeting community members and community organizations where they are today as opposed to where we know they were last year, I think is important and ties back into that point from the previous slide about the significance of communication in this era. And I think also making sure that you're taking seriously your disciplinary perspective and what it has to say in this current moment of crisis can be an important anchor as you design experiential opportunities. And finally, intentional reflection. Reflection is not something that simply happens at the end. You can't just add it on as a cherry on top of the experience. Really, it's much more foundational than that and needs to be encouraged throughout the process, from establishing clear expectations through kind of deep and iterative reflections throughout the process and upon completion of the experiential learning opportunity. There will be another session in this experiential learning series later this month that focuses explicitly on reflection. So once you've gone back to the drawing board, back to the ceramics wheel, and you've re-engineered your goals and your experiences that you're planning for your classroom, you'll then need to think of the tools that will help you achieve those goals. And these tools might look somewhat different than a typical semester, but I think they'll be somewhat similar to what we've just worked with through the spring of 2020, as we've all had to shift to remote education. So virtual meetings, things that used to happen in person are now happening in a digital space. That will be true of our partnerships and collaborations with community members and organizations as well. So find the platform that your students and the community partner are comfortable with, whether it's Zoom or FaceTime or Skype or any of the laundry lists of technological solutions. Those are available. CTL is here to support you in doing that as well. Similarly, online polling can replace or substitute for paper surveys or in-person interviews that happen in many community engaged learning courses. So shifting this data collection to an online format is going to be necessary for many cases and will, I think, allow similar types of collection. And then also thinking about products for the community engaged learning, making that a digital piece, something that is accessible without in-person communication, without the risk that that entails, and thinking about this as, in some ways, a way to expand the audience for any of these products as well, giving them a longer shelf life than a one-off one-on-one or in-person exchange. You can put it online and then allow it to be used in the future as well. So if you want to go the opposite direction from the high-tech solutions, you could go with more low-tech approaches, especially if you're working with a community partner comprised of people with somewhat less tech savviness. Some of these options might be more useful. So the old-fashioned telephone might be a tool to add to the toolkit. We all carry around computers in our pockets, but those computers also make calls, traditional cell phones, traditional phone calls. And we can use those for the types of things that we would have done perhaps in person. You can use snail mail and paper to collect information or dialogue with people. So that could take the form of sending out physical paper surveys, or if you're working with a younger audience, it might take the form of kind of a pen pals type situation in which you're working with, say, students at a local school or students at a regional or national school, perhaps even internationally. But the paper component could be a low-tech solution. And another way to think about this is to leverage existing relationships. Say if you had traditionally gone out into the community to interview seniors at a local senior center about their experiences in a certain era, perhaps you rethink how you find that population to interview, and perhaps you leverage the existing relationships that the students in your class have. So I wouldn't recommend having people interview their own grandparents, but having them interview a peer's grandparent could allow kind of similar pedagogical approaches and could encourage kind of the formation of a community within that classroom as well. So leveraging existing relationships is another possible low-tech solution. If we end up in a hybrid situation in the fall in which you're meeting with your students in person part of the time and others are not in your physical presence, or you're meeting kind of any sort of hybrid situation in which you're talking some people face-to-face and some people digitally, you might consider staggering the community engagement activities, having people work with the community, if that's remotely, when they're not in your physical classroom, and then swapping that. So on Tuesday, a certain group would work with the community partner, and then Thursday, the other half of the class would work with the community partner, and they would swap I think is one way to stagger things. You might also consider mixed groups. So if you have a Tuesday bunch and a Thursday bunch, I would envision groups that are comprised of both Tuesday and Thursday students so that they kind of have more perspectives and more flexibility in terms of interacting with the community partner while also receiving the course material in the classroom. And I think for a hybrid scenario, we'll really want to lean into flexible products. So aiming for the collaboration to result in some sort of outcome that can be useful either in person or remotely. So perhaps this is a set of slides with complete speaker's notes so that you can have a similar experience whether or not a center student is able to physically be with the audience when it is presented. So thinking in terms of flexibility, I think, is key for a hybrid type scenario as we might find ourselves in. Now, if we find ourselves in a remote scenario in which you have no physical contact, no in-person interactions with your students, my first piece of advice is maybe a little unorthodox for somebody supporting community engaged learning, but I would really stress the importance of engaging the classroom community first. So creating a community atmosphere and making sure that there is a level of comfort and trust within that remote classroom, I think is an important and a vital first step before you go out to start building connections in the wider community. And this is going to be a much bigger challenge remotely than it is if we're able to be hybrid or in person. And I would say that I think this is going to be a bigger challenge in some ways than it was this spring as well. If we end up in a remote circumstance, there's a chance that you will have not had those students physically in one room together, so you don't have the rudiments of that community that we all rely on often in our classrooms. So really trying to take the time to engage the classroom community first, I think, will be absolutely vital if we end up in a remote scenario. So engaging the classroom community, perhaps creating micro communities, smaller nodes of students that work together, meet together regularly, something in the range of 3 to 5 students who can form their own micro community from which they have a base to reach out to the broader community and make some impact and make some contribution. And of course, in a remote situation, all the products, all of the outcomes from this should be virtual and should have value for the partner organization in a virtual space. So whether that is an infographic instead of a presentation or a screencast video rather than a in-person conference. Thinking about how to make it a virtual yet still valuable product at the outcome as the end goal for this collaboration, I think, is key in a remote scenario. And my final thoughts. Please see the accompanying resource guide for specific opportunities. This is looking a little light, particularly on the local category at the moment. That's because I don't have specifics on many of our organizations, community partner organizations at the moment. This resource guide will be updated on July 1st and August 1st, so please check back to see what has changed in the local scenario especially. Consider joining the Experiential Learning FLC in July. This will give you a chance to talk about some best practices in experiential learning and to workshop ideas with your peers. The idea for one of the culminating events of the FLC will be to work on and work through experiential components that we're hoping to use in our own classrooms in the fall and in the spring of the next academic year. So you'll be able to get feedback from your peers on exactly what you're planning for your class in this circumstance. And finally, I can help. I really can. I will love to help set you up with a community partner to talk about the possibilities, to explore whether or not community engaged learning is right for your class in this circumstance. And I'm not a one-size-fits-all type of person who's going to tell you that, yes, you definitely need to do this. We can have a legitimate dialogue about whether or not this is a good fit based on your course, your discipline, and the current circumstances of the moment. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks.